So if we factor in all rewards, so like everything you get for running your validator, whether you propose a block or not, these games kind of mean nothing. At this point, consensus rewards are something like 80% of value. So that extra 10% from timing games is actually only 20% of 20%, or sorry, 10% of 20%. So you really only get like an extra 2% in total. And if we're putting the network at risk for an extra 2%, like we're kind of just being stupid.
Welcome to another episode of the Index podcast, where the three of us come together every couple of weeks to discuss on-chain data, chart crimes, and metrics that move the crypto industry. And today, it's actually the four of us. So the four of us being Denning, on-chain corgi at Flashbots.
Hi.
Hildobby, resident data house elf at Dragonfly.
Hello, hello.
Our special guest today, DataAlways. Just call me DataAlways at Flashbots.
Hey, nice to be here.
And I am Boxer, and I am the community powerhouse at Dune. Before we start, nothing we say here should be relied upon as legal, financial, investment, tax, or even life advice. We are acting independently of our respective professional roles here. And with that out of the way, welcome DataAlways. Very glad to have you here. I've kind of seen you around crypto Twitter for the last, I want to say, 1.5, 2 years. So very excited to actually hear your voice and get to meet you here in this podcast. So maybe as a start, if you could just give us a rundown of like how did you end up here, like being an ETH researcher, and I think you emerged on Twitter kind of out of nowhere, and you immediately went into the deep end. So like how did that emerge? I'm just interested in the story here.
Yeah, sure. So what I would start off by saying is that I don't think I did emerge out of anywhere. I probably just wasn't part of the on-chain community. And for a long time, I was a bit more focused in the Bitcoin space. So I've actually been around for probably 4 to 5 years, if not a bit longer, in crypto for longer. But sort of one day, a couple years ago, I fell in love with Dune and eventually MEV data, and sort of just kept diving deeper and deeper and down. Here we are today.
Oh, I see. So you were kind of part of another, like you were part of the Bitcoin camp, right? I remember you did some ordinals like work, and you spotted, like you did great work on, I think I even referred to this in the podcast a bunch of times, where it's like, oh, how was this called? Like somebody was blocking like a bunch of ordinals. There was like a special name for it, which was related to this like three body problem. Like there was some connection there, but whatever. So you actually, so you come from the Bitcoin camp, and then eventually you were like, oh, okay, like there's nothing really interesting happening on Bitcoin. Let me see what else is out there. Is that kind of the story?
I mean, there was a very brief period of my time where I was like a Bitcoin laser-eyed maxi, and luckily those days are behind me. But I still really do love Bitcoin. I just find Ethereum much more interesting. So that's where I spend my time.
Yeah, there's actually stuff happening here. Stuff to analyze. And is your background like kind of like did you study this? Is this all self-taught? And like without doxing yourself, like you can give like however much of a vague answer you want to.
Yeah, so my background is physics, and after that into TradFi, as all failed physicists go. And then eventually TradFi just got boring, and I found Bitcoin, and the rest is kind of history.
Okay, I see. Yeah, cool. Interesting. I think that explains a bit of your style of communication, and like the your communication style strikes me as very structured, and like physics background seems to like you seem to like have to have a very straight mind, or like a very ordered mind in order to be able to understand physics. Okay, interesting. So today we've invited you to talk about block building or like this is kind of a continuation of the block building series that we started last I guess it's not last week, but last episode with Burak. And now Dobby and me are going to learn that there's also a timing aspect to all of this block building. And DataAlways has kindly prepared a presentation to actually just walk us through the high level topics here. But maybe if I can throw a cheeky question to Dobby, what do you know about latency games or just the timing of block proposing on Ethereum today?
Honestly, I'm not that deep. What I know is what I've seen from like DataAlways and Tony Wolfalter on Twitter. And it's yeah, I think I've got a lot to learn. I understand the basics about how like delaying a bit and waiting for like MEV to build up in a block before you actually propose it can lead to more MEV for you. So yeah, I understand the basics, but I don't know how deep the rabbit hole goes.
I think it goes very deep, and I'm excited to dive in there. So yeah, Data always, if you just want to share your screen, start the presentation.
To sort of understand where we are today, I think the best thing to do is to go back to the beginning. And the beginning is proof of work, and it's actually Bitcoin. So proof of work has what we call exponential block times. And for anyone who's like not a big math guy, basically that's the idea that the protocol and Bitcoin mining is memoryless. So when Bitcoin miners are competing for a block and they get the wrong answer, they don't actually really gain any information. So you have, like, when you're trying to figure out the next block, you have infinite right answers and infinite wrong answers. So what stems from this is like the protocol's designed so you have 10-minute block times, but if people have been guessing for 5 minutes and they don't have any more information, there's still 10 minutes on average until the next block. And I mean, that's really cool, but it also means that you have this really long tail behavior where a couple times a week you end up with like an hour or more between blocks. And Ethereum had the same thing, right? When Ethereum was proof of work. So even though Ethereum block times were something like 13 seconds, from time to time, you'd still have like 2 to 3 minutes. And if you're trying to build like a DeFi ecosystem with 2 to 3 minute block times, it's a bit of a mess. So about 2 years ago, there was this big event called the merge, and Ethereum switched from proof of work to proof of stake. And what happened for block times is they switched from this random mess to 12 seconds, always 12 seconds. Or, well, at least usually 12 seconds. If there's a missed slot, then you can have 24 seconds or 36 seconds between blocks. But the normal case is 12 seconds. And this is a chart from back when Kyle Waters and Nate Madry were running coin metrics. And it basically just like really quickly shows that there's this immediate switch from the noisy distribution to invariant block times, with the blocks being 12 seconds apart. And then you see the second line above that's, oh man, my cursor works. You have the second line where block times are 24 seconds, and those are right after a missed block. But the reality is that this chart's a little bit of a lie. And to understand why it's a lie, we need to look at the boundary of blocks. So the way that the system works right now is basically everyone uses MEV boost. And I mean, often you'll say that something like 90% of validators use it, but the reality is that something like 98%. And the difference in this is things like min bid usage and client misconfigurations. So sometimes the system just like falls back to normal usage. But the number's closer to like 97 or 98%. So we really should just assume it's everybody. From a timing perspective, the way this system works is that at the end of a block, t equals 0 on this chart, the proposer goes and requests a block from a relay. The block takes a bit of time to get to the relay, or sorry, the request takes a bit of time to get to the relay. The relay then returns a block. So, I mean, the proposer calls for a block from like 5 or 6 different relays. Each of them returns a block. The proposer chooses the best one, signs the header, And then once the relay sees that the header's been signed, they propagate the block to everywhere. But from a timing games perspective, what we see is that this initial latency step before the relay returns the request means that it's not always actually 12 seconds. And you have some noise here, and you can play around with it a bit. So when we sort of model this, what we find is that when we model this, especially if we look at data from maybe like a year ago, we see that the distribution of these times, that's the time that the relay gets the block that wins the auction. The profile is actually really wide. And over the last year, there's been some big shifts in this that we'll probably talk about. But if we go back a year, the median winning block time was something like 400 milliseconds. And the most common one was like 100 milliseconds. So it's pretty low, and it's not really a big deal. It's the system working as designed. But basically, that's where this divergence between blocks, and basically if we take any two random times on this profile, some will be more than 12 seconds and some will be less than 12 seconds. So if we take that and now we construct a bit more of a real picture of what block times are, we get this profile. So instead of this normal 12-second line, instead, we have a bunch of blocks that take between 9 seconds and 15 seconds. And this is sort of the real version of the coin metrics chart. So even though the timestamps on chain are 12 seconds, you get some blocks that are like 8 seconds and some blocks that are 16 seconds. And if we take enough of this data, we can create a distribution of this. And we get this nice symmetric distribution around 12 seconds. It's not quite normal, but you see that like the vast majority of blocks are between 11 and 13 seconds, and it's not really a big deal. But once you start to get these outliers that are like 9 seconds versus 15 seconds, all of a sudden that's like a 66% difference. And if you're on the winning side of this versus the losing side of this, it's a big deal. So how are we doing so far? Have I already lost you guys, or are we doing okay?
I love this. This is great. I was just about to jump in. Kind of following, but can you make like an actual example of like what happens if a block gets accepted after 8 seconds? Because like on the blockchain, they're all like, if you look at the timestamps, it's like 12 seconds, 12 seconds, 12 seconds, right? So like how does that actually, is it just like, okay, the winning bid has been submitted at like 4 seconds before the actual block gets included? Like how does that work?
Yeah, so with the 8-second block, what that would mean is that the block before you took close to 16 seconds. So then when you're building your next block, you're starting 4 seconds late, and you only have 8 seconds worth of data if you're being like an honest proposer, proposing blocks at 0 seconds.
Maybe the diagram is very helpful. The first one you were showing about how the timestamp within the slot work. I think this one.
If you imagine sort of like two of these plots back to back, right? So this is the first slot here, and then you have another slot that starts here and extends past to the right, and extends all the way to 12 seconds for the next block. So what you see, if you have a really late block and we shift this sort of process later to maybe like over here and starts at like 3,000 milliseconds, then all of a sudden the sort of bids at the start of the block over here are kind of being cut off, and you see a shift in this whole profile over to the right.
Yeah, my way of reading this chart is basically like, as indicated here, you see like the x-axis is a T, and we know that Ethereum is operating on like 12-second block auctions. So like every 12 seconds is a slot, and the T equals to 0 here. I think doesn't really have any like enforcement, right? Like the only thing that you will get punished or like slashed for, or not really slashed, but like it like the only hard rule here is the t equal to 4, like which is labeled as attestation deadline. So my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, or confirm me if there's it's correct. It's like the proposer will have to get the block before the t equals to 4. Otherwise, then it's a missed slot. And so t equal to 0 is more like a suggested time for you to basically start to get the block. But there's no real like law or anything to enforce you to do it at the t0. So you technically can do it across the 12-second slot as long as it's before t equals to 4, right? And then on a 12-second horizon, t equals to 4 if, as a benchmark, the start of the slot is t minus 8. And the t minus 8 is the last slot's t equals to 4, right? And so to Bach's question, what happens if a block at t minus 8 get confirmed? That would means if the last block t equals 4 just got accepted, say at t equals to 1, t equals 2, then there's only 1 or 2 seconds of pending transaction comes in that can be included in the next block that you're building. So this block will be fairly empty or like fairly low value. And it wouldn't make sense for any proposer to really just like accept a block at t minus 8, because supposedly you could have had a lot more transaction in the even in the mempool to come in to have a higher block for you to get higher rewards, is my understanding.
Yeah, that's right. And sort of the reason the system works like this is just because it's like a decentralized P2P system, and you sort of have to factor in latency, right? So, I mean, if you have a bunch of people in Australia and some people in North America and some people in Europe, like you need to allow some time for these signals to propagate. And under sort of like traditional non-MEV boost, that system makes a lot of sense. But because the MEV boost system is extremely highly optimized, we really don't need this 4-second gap.
Do you know the rationale behind block time being 12 seconds? I'm guessing it's very much tied to hardware limitations and trying to make sure you can run this on as low as possible hardware. But do you know why 12 seconds specifically, or yeah, any reasoning behind it?
I don't think there's like necessarily a firm reason, right? There's a lot of discussions today about changing it. Some people want to move to shorter block times. But the downside of that is most apps have been created assuming that block times are 12 seconds, right? So if you cut that in half, and who knows like what you're trying to time in that, right? You just run into big problems.
And I have another question, but that's actually tied to the first slide you had. How does a block happen before, like, those blue outliers in the first part? What causes those to not follow the trend? What happened there?
That's a really good question. So basically what happens with Bitcoin is that everybody works in these pools, and when a block is found, it takes a little bit of switching time for pools to transmit that information to all their miners so that their new miners can start working on the new blocks. So, I mean, this is a logarithmic chart on the x-axis, in case you didn't notice. So most of those outliers are at like 10 seconds, 15 seconds. And during that time, you don't really see that many blocks.
Okay, cool.
For Ethereum, on the other hand, when Ethereum was proof of work, if you were to create the same chart for that, the most common block time was like 0 seconds or 1 second. So it's kind of crazy.
Why is that? I have one assumption. I remember there was a lot of miners trying to create empty blocks when there was 2 ETH rewards for block level, but I don't know if that's why or what you referred to.
Yeah, so the incentives for creating an empty block were almost as strong as creating a full block. And the idea is that if you found a block right away and you didn't fill it, all of a sudden somebody else might come around and find it, right? So if you waited too long, you'd lose all your rewards.
So if I understand this correctly, so I get picked as a proposer. Like I'm a validator, and then like I get a proposer slot, right? And then basically what you guys have just explained is I then have kind of 400 milliseconds to actually like fulfill my promise or like fulfill that duty of proposing a block. And in that time frame, most often like this will kind of take 200, 300 milliseconds or something like this. But in extreme cases, and because of kind of global network latency, I have a slot of like to actually kind of 4,000 milliseconds. Is that like, did I understand that correctly?
Okay, so you know ahead of time when your block's going to be. So it's not like you just find out and instantly you have to create this, right? They assign slots a bit in advance. And then they're 12 seconds apart. So 12 seconds being 12,000 milliseconds. And when a block finishes kind of thing, you sort of have this 4,000. You have this 4 second period in which you must propose a block, otherwise it's missed. And usually, like if you have a highly optimized system, you can take care of that inside of a couple hundred milliseconds, and then the block will propagate to the network really quickly. But if you're not a well-connected validator, then you're right, it could take up to the 4,000 milliseconds, and that's why the buffer is this long.
Okay, so basically, after like the previous block has been included in the chain, then I kind of like my target time is 12,000 milliseconds. But in extreme cases, I can take up to 16,000 milliseconds. And basically, what we're discussing here is people abusing the fact that you have this kind of like, or like it shouldn't even be, because like the block before me can also be delayed. So like then my problem, then I get less time basically. So but then there's some like kind of boundaries here where it's like this should happen at a certain UTC time, or like how does the blockchain like internally even keep track of like this time? Like is it like the target is always 12 seconds, I guess?
Yeah, the target's 12 seconds. I think the only thing that keeps track of it is every like individual node's timestamps, like on their local machine. You kind of create this global consensus out of that.
Okay, and then from the time of the merge until infinity, or like a protocol change, I guess it's always like within that 12-second interval, there should be a new block that is propagated and or like validated across the network.
Yes.
Okay, and then if the person before me, or like the validator before me, the proposer before me, misses their like they kind of steal time from me to submit my next 12 seconds epoch.
Yeah. So if you're right after somebody who steals time from you and you're an honest actor, that means you could have as little as 8 seconds. Whereas if you're somebody who's doing the stealing, you could have up to 16 seconds.
Now I think we can continue. Now I've understood why some blocks can take 8 seconds, where it's like, okay, somebody has stolen 4 seconds from like some, I don't know. It could also be network connectivity issues, but arguably this is probably not the case. So like then I only have 8 seconds. So that's how we get to 8 seconds block. And the extreme case of like 16 seconds is somebody who just plays those timing games. And now we're gonna learn how kind of far spread they actually are, and why it matters. Okay, cool. Thanks.
To point out as how this chart nicely noted that like proposer has 2 steps to get the block, right? So the green one here shows that first they need to get header, and for get header, the proposer only sees what's a block hash and what's a value, and so that's like a rational decision step, basically saying, okay, I'm gonna know what's the block value I'm gonna get, and then I'm gonna do the signing process to actually say I'm committing this, and then I'm gonna then get payload, which is like get the full block. And I think the 2 rules here is that you want to get as high value as possible for the block. So my understanding is you want to delay the get header call as much as possible, assumingly the block value is going up. And then the second rule is you can't get payload later than t equals to 4,000 milliseconds. Otherwise, you're missing a slot. And so with this 2 rule, then how the proposer will play to their best interest is basically the timing again. I think the data always going to tell us. Yes.
Okay, hold on. We opened another box of Pandora here. Get header is me as a proposer calling a relay and getting basically the metadata about the block, right? It's like I get the block
Mhm.
hash and then I get how much in rewards I get.
Yes.
And then once I actually commit to, okay, I'm gonna pick this block and like I'm actually gonna do this, then
Mhm.
that's the get payload call, and then I actually kind of propagate the block.
Yes, that's like commit reveal scheme.
Okay.
Yeah, and
All
with
right.
a get payload call, the original sort of idea is that they return it to the proposer and the proposer propagates the block. But because relays are so interconnected with everybody, usually with the get payload call, the relay is just like, okay, we've seen that the block is signed. Now it's safe to distribute it everywhere. And the relay actually does the propagation. Okay, so we got a bit ahead of ourselves with that conversation. And now we're going to talk about how block values change. And there was this great post from Thomas Cherry from the EF that modeled this about a year ago. And he basically showed that the median increase in a block is linear with time. And this is the model that people use mostly because it's very simple. And we see that if you wait an extra 2 seconds on a 12-second block, then you get like an extra 20% of value almost. So basically, what happens is proposers are incentivized to wait as long as possible to get their block. And this is kind of the basis of timing games. The longer that you wait, the more value you get. But then, as Danning suggested as well, on the other hand, the network balances this out by adding some risk with the attestation deadline. So basically, if validators wait too long, then they risk their entire block, not just the like little bit extra that they're getting. And then the block doesn't make it on chain. So you have these two competing forces. One is the longer you wait, the more money you get. And the other is that if you wait too long, you lose all your money. And if we combine these two profiles, then when I ran the numbers about 6 months ago, I found that the best time to propose a block was at just after 2 seconds. And by doing that, you get about an extra 15% in value. But of course, the downside again is that if you're slow and you wait too long and you're already playing these games, then you lose all your money. And that's kind of the theory about optimizing timing games. And so that's why these actors are doing this. And when I say these actors, I really only mean 2 or 3 entities. You have Kiln, who's playing very aggressive timing games, and we'll focus a bit more on them later. We have P2P, who has been really public about their timing games, but they're really not playing aggressive timing games. And Chorus 1 sort of falls into the same group, but Chorus 1 is a pretty small validator set as well. All of those 3 are also actually Lido node operators, but P2P and Chorus don't play timing games on their Lido nodes, although Kiln does. So when P2P began playing timing games, their profile shifted like this, and it's a really clean diagram. Basically, before P2P started playing timing games, they had their maximum at about 0 seconds, which is actually probably more than honest behavior, right? I mean, back at this time, the median block time the median bit arrival time was something like 400 milliseconds. So by P2P being such a heavily optimized and interconnected validator, what they actually found is they were losing money compared to just like a normal home staker who's using MEV Boost. And I mean, that's kind of a screwed up system. So what they decided is that if they started delaying their blocks, they could catch up to the rest of the system and not really add any risk onto the network. So they started introducing artificial latency into the system, and everything was good, with the exception of like a lot of community backlash. People like complaining about like, why are you doing this? Why are you trying to damage the system? Why are you adding risks? But the reality is that they were just losing money compared to everybody else because they were too efficient. And you still do see a lot of node operators like that today. Some of the ones like Blockdaemon or I don't know. Basically, if you think of any of the like well-behaved professional operators, they're actually losing money compared to somebody like a Rocket Pool staker, just because their setup is faster. So if we look at the chart for Rocket Pool around the same time, though, we actually see some interesting stuff too. So Rocket Pool, if you don't know what they are, is a decentralized validator set, and it's not really possible for them to coordinate, yet we still do see similarities in the profile. Starting in December, their profile changed a lot. It started to shift later. So the question that kind of comes from here is, if it's not even possible for them to play timing games, how did they start playing timing games? And I mean, I'm sure Danning knows the answer, but do Boxer or Hildab, you have any ideas what started happening?
I'm not sure whether was there like I know I actually have no idea what happened. Rocket Pool is very intriguing, given, like you said, it's impossible to coordinate.
Can we quickly unveil what Rocket Pool is? I think I know, but one of you will be better explaining.
So Rocket Pool is essentially anyone can run his own node, but since the requirements for in terms of ETH are very high, 32 ETH, there's a way to kind of someone can like pull ETH into a pool, and then someone else can say, "Hey, I'll run it, but only commit a certain portion of that ETH and take some of the rest of the ETH from that pool." To essentially run a node at lower costs, and then distribute the rewards in the end. And that's all decentralized.
Okay, and now we're saying they can't play timing games because they're all bound to this, like the rules of this decentralized peer-to-peer network, which basically makes up one validator at a time, right?
I think anyone can, but it's weird to see all of them coordinate at once when there's really no communication channel between all of them, really.
Yeah, so I mean, in theory, they could play timing games. Like each operator can choose to, but because they just like talk in discords and stuff, they're not out here modifying consensus clients to intentionally delay things, or at least in theory. So the answer, anyway, is relays. So starting right after P2P decided to introduce delays into their blocks, Bloxer realized that if they started to do the same thing, then all of a sudden they could win more blocks and get more value for their validators. So you see the shift in the profile where all of a sudden the yellow line moves particularly quickly to the right, and that's Bloxroot. And then after Bloxroot started to increase their share, sort of Ultrasound realized, Ultrasound's another relay. They realized that if they didn't start doing the same thing, they were going to lose all their market share. So you have these two major entities who started doing this, and they became much more powerful. Whereas on the other hand, relays like Flashbots or Agnostic, they decided not to play these games. And all of a sudden, like the Flashbots relay market share dropped from something like 30% down to like less than 10% often. So it's clear that the system is working for Bloxroot and for Ultrasound, but they're kind of behaving strangely, right? They're not doing what the validator asks. They're doing what is best for the validator. And I mean, it's not like necessarily a great situation, but also like who's going to complain about making more money, right?
Just to make sure I understand this, like if I call get header, is there now a 500 millisecond delayed response, and that's how this works? Or like how, because the relay is essentially just like they're collecting all the bits from the block builders, and then like they just get called, right? But where do they just delay that call, or like what happens?
Yeah, so relays have a bit more information on who's actually calling, right? And they know where the validator is located. So they can determine that, like, oh, okay, if we add an extra 500 milliseconds of latency, it's not really going to add any risk to the network. They're not going to be more likely to lose the block. So they can add in like a 500 millisecond delay. And there are some limits on this. The big one being that consensus clients have a timeout in case a relay is down or isn't returning data. And I think the most common one is at like 1,000 milliseconds. So at that point, if relays try and delay any longer, they're just not going to have their bits considered by the proposer.
Okay, wow. So I gotta assume there also is competition between the relays, and now the relays have basically found, okay, if or like how, like, if I configure my validator, do I configure multiple relays that I call, or do I just call one relay?
You have the option, but most people configure multiple relays.
Yeah, I run a home validator, and when I plug into MapBoost, I'm like, why not all the relays? Because the more relay, I will get more values to compare, and the higher value I may get. Unless, like there's a layer of social credits there, I guess. If we know that relay is well known to be not a good player, then I may not, right?
Okay, but now then your, like, you get chosen for a slot, and then your relay starts calling, or your validator starts calling all of the different relays, and then some relays will answer fast and some relays will answer slower, and then like how so, and then you said there's a timeout of a, or like there's a client timeout of 1,000 milliseconds. So basically in that 1 second, like whichever like relay returns the highest get block is, or like the highest value block, then I choose that one. Is that kind of the logic here?
Yeah. And like if I only get a bit from Flashbots and Bloxroute haven't responded, I might as well wait until I have to respond, right?
Yeah.
And then because those relays, like, they just wait for more bits of block builders to come in, which linearly increase with time. They're just like, okay, we can just like push the system to its thresholds, get the actual like latest bits that are physically possible. Oh man, this
Yeah.
is okay. I understood.
Yeah,
yeah,
I
and
guess like if any proposer asked before t equals to 1,000, the blocks were relay be like, you should have not asked that early because like, whoever asked earlier is kind of dumb in this case because you always wanted to wait for longer. And then they're like, let me do this for you and I'll wait until t minus equals to 1 to give you the block bit.
yeah, exactly. And even before relays started delaying it, there was still this like big difference, right? So Boxer, you're in Europe. If you're proposing a block, and let's say you're using ultrasound and flashbots, when you make that request to ultrasound, if they're not adding any delays, then you're going to get your response in like 50 milliseconds. But because the latency over to the West Coast of the United States is like 200 milliseconds, you're going to get a block back from Flashbots like 400 milliseconds later. And Flashbots is going to have sort of that latency time to build a better block than you. So Blockthrough basically saw that because they're a very well-connected validator set, they were just losing money. They weren't winning blocks because people had their requests traveling further. Okay. So now what we can do is we can sort of look at the data for all blocks at one relay, and we can start to normalize what's actually happening. So if we take like a rolling 1-day average, I think this was based off of a 12-hour average or something, and we compare the winning rocket pool block times to the median winning block time at the relay where the block was first found, we see that the profiles once again match up. So the big change for rocket pool was a change at the relay level. And the validators for rocket pool aren't actually coordinating. Everything's good. The system works again. But on the other hand, if we try to do the same thing for P2P, we see that although the profile does shift and there's a bit of a change, there's still this big gap. And maybe the nice part about this GIF is that it shows that before P2P started playing these timing games, their profile was well before 0 seconds. So this kind of gives a bit more credence to this idea that P2P was this really well-connected validator and they were losing money. And now they're adding this artificial latency and they're actually making more money than everyone else. Okay, so I was going to stop for questions again. I know we've talked a lot. Are we still doing okay, or where are the pain points?
The like two gifts. What like can you express in words what the different like what is the difference that we actually see now?
Okay, so for the GIF that doesn't say normalized in the top right-hand corner, that's the same as the P2 as the original P2P profile, which is completely unnormalized and just shows the winning block arrival times at the relay. So this is, if we imagine this like long chart way back when, we'll go back there quickly. This is where P2P showed up in that chart, which is somewhere like this after their change, and initially was somewhere like over here. And then when we start to normalize it by the relay, we look at here where like the average time for the relay came in. And when we account for that, the two profiles, I guess for P2P, they don't come together, but for Rocket Pool, they come together.
Okay, now I see what normalized is basically like you're adjusting for the time for the delay that the relay that the relay has introduced now. So it's like this is now purely isolating the actions of p2p.org, which is like the validator operator. So they're additionally kind of introducing a timing delay here.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry if that was if I took a bit long, but okay, I see.
But other than that, we're good.
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the last thing I really want to talk about is Kiln. So Kiln is the one validator that's actually playing the most aggressive timing games. And if we look at their block profile, it's very obvious. The average block for them is at like 2 seconds, but for everyone else, it's still before 1 second. And the natural question that follows is like, how much of a benefit is Kiln getting from this, and how much damage are they doing to the network? So Tony from the EF has actually kind of led the charge on this, and he basically looked at the attestation data for blocks by Kiln and by other proposers, and found that for Kiln blocks, about 10% of validators don't attest to the right block in time. For everyone else, it's basically just a couple of percent, but Kiln is clearly pushing things. And the question sort of becomes like, is Kiln pushing things too far? Like, obviously the people that are using Kiln are really happy, but is this okay for everybody else? And I mean, I think there's still a little bit of debate in the ecosystem, but I think there's very few people that are kind of happy with Kiln at this point, right? I think they're clearly starting to affect other people, and it's probably time to be a bit more aggressive in calling out their behavior. But I mean, that's obviously just a personal opinion. Everyone's entitled to their own thoughts. So how much money is Kiln actually making from this? We do see that they're getting a pretty good edge, but basically, if instead of using MEV Boost, Kiln built their blocks locally, they would only get something like 19% of their current rewards. And then from opting into MEV Boost, they get an extra 72%. And obviously, it makes a lot of sense to do that. And that's why MEV Boost is really popular. But the timing games part is only like 10%. And even though that's still kind of a lot, and I guess that's why Kiln does it, it's not like that much. So one person who's really been talking about this a lot is Yuri from Bloxroot. And he kind of tries to drive home the point that MEV rewards are actually really small. And maybe putting some words into his mouth, it doesn't really make sense to play these games which is a little ironic considering that blocks root is delaying blocks. But he's certainly somebody who's been pushing that we should focus less on MEV rewards. So if we factor in all rewards, so like everything you get for running your validator, whether you propose a block or not, these games kind of mean nothing. At this point, consensus rewards are something like 80% of value. So that extra 10% from timing games is actually only 20% of 20%, or sorry, 10% of 20%. So you really only get like an extra 2% in total. And if we're putting the network at risk for an extra 2%, like we're kind of just being stupid. And as much as I think these games are really cool and they're like a very fascinating thing to look at in data, people realistically just, we should stop playing them. The problem, of course, is that, I mean, we're in a decentralized network and there's not really good ways to stop people from doing it. So people tend to revert to social pressure. But there are a couple of possible mitigations and things that people have proposed. So one of the original ideas came from Casper at the EF, and it was basically to turn relays into policemen. And unfortunately, this really isn't something that relays want to do. They already aren't making any money, so giving them more duties is kind of a non-starter. And I mean, as soon as one relay doesn't behave and tries to do their own thing, all of a sudden they just start to beat all the other relays. So unless you can have this like perfect social coordination that never breaks down, it's really just an idea. Another idea was an option that's been pushed a lot by Max Resnick from SMG, is to start adding missed slot penalties. The idea here is that if we punish validators more for missing blocks, it kind of changed the risk calculus, and it makes people want to play less aggressive games. But the problem with this is that solo stakers are kind of notoriously bad for their uptime, so it would hit them a lot. And overall, it's probably just not a good option. The sort of more nuclear option is people are discussing changing the entire auction design. And regardless of timing games, this is probably something that's going to happen anyway. I mean, there's lots of discussions about moving to slot auctions and people talking about things like execution tickets. And there's lots of research ongoing about the issues with these things and whether they'll actually help the situation. But if things got bad enough quickly, I mean, in theory, we could just swap the entire auction out that MEV Boost uses or enshrine something else in protocol. But those are really big changes, so it's kind of scary. And that's kind of where I fall, where none of these are good options. So the best thing to do is kind of just to sit back and do nothing. Like at this point, even though Kiln isn't really being a great actor, they're not really doing any damage to the network. So until more people start playing these games, like it's good to actively research solutions, but whether it's actually time to implement a change, it's probably not, in my mind, it's probably not a priority. But also, like, I don't know, some people like to freak out over this stuff, so maybe we'll see a change. But I don't think that there's anything proposed for the next couple hard forks. And that's kind of my story around timing games. I mean, I have extra slides if you guys want to see more things, but
I got questions. If Kiln is you losing like 10% of their blocks, are like if you don't fill your slot, you also don't get the consensus rewards, right? So
yeah, so Kiln isn't
are
missing.
you factoring that in you? Ah, okay, so they're not.
So what that means back here is that 10% of validators aren't voting on the right block. So because you're in like a decentralized consensus, you still have 90% that are voting for it being the right block on average, and that's enough for it to make it on chain. Obviously, 10% is just an average here, and it's actually a distribution where, like, I don't know, sometimes it's only 50%, and often it's 100%. But as long as you reach some point, which I think is, I mean, it's probably more than 50%, you end up making it on chain. And the calculus is a little bit more complicated because of this thing called proposer boost. So basically, the next proposer in the system gets an additional 40% weight for their choice. So I mean, they're the one driving the ship, so they have a bit of an extra sort of thing. So if at least 30% of the network misses the block, and then they also miss the block, you could all of a sudden have like this 30% plus 40% voting for the wrong block, and then all of a sudden we're at 70-70, and you could get a reorg quickly.
Okay, so they're just propagating the blocks so late that then on average 10% of attesters kind of have the wrong, or like they attest to the wrong block. Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, that's the right idea.
Okay, I see. And who is Kiln even, or however that entity? Yeah, Kiln.
I mean, they're just a validator set. They run validators for a lot of other entities as well. For Lido, I think they run some for Swell, but they're just a node operator basically, and that's what they do.
Okay, so the social pressure here would be Lido being like, okay, guys, cut the crap, otherwise we're gonna cut you from our validator set or whatever. But I guess that's on Lido governance or something. Or like, yeah, I guess the like end user social pressure would be not using Lido because Lido uses Kiln. But that's a very long road, and I guess it's not very feasible to actually do this. But remind me of or like tell me about the risks that Kiln is introducing to the network here. What is the actual downside of them? Or like I don't know, if I see this and I'm like, yeah, 10% of people like attest to the wrong block. Like what's the big deal? Maybe shed some light on that.
So maybe the most interesting part about this is that when 80% of your rewards come from consensus, if 10% are all of a sudden missing this, then you get something like 8% of rewards missing. Or sorry, the consensus rewards are broken down into many parts. So voting for the correct block is only like 20% of the 80%. But all of a sudden, if 10% of people are voting for the wrong blocks in this 20% of the 80%, all of a sudden you see that something like 2% or 3% of value is being missed by other validators. So when there's a block that's actually longer that's coming from Kiln, the funny part is the entire network as a whole sees fewer rewards, even though like Kiln is getting an outsized share, everybody else is getting less. And on the whole, even though they're using 14 seconds instead of 12 seconds, the rewards for everybody are smaller.
Okay, so they're just deploying. It's kind of a maximum greedy strategy, and it seems like very short term. I don't know, short term greediness for long, like just for nothing essentially.
My understanding of like the Kiln situation is basically sounds like they're trying to get the 1.9 extra percent from timing game, but as DataAlways said, they're also losing money from the missed vote for like the 80% times 20%, which is almost also like 2%. And so they're trying to like, they have a full bucket of things and they're still trying to like pick up something else from the ground. And meanwhile, they're doing that. They're like, it's like, had to drop some stuff on their hands already. So it's like, doesn't make sense at all.
Yeah, so I definitely think it makes sense for somebody like P2P to just like add a little bit of latency. But when you get to the point of like Kiln actually delaying this long, it's kind of crazy.
Okay, so the state of Ethereum today is basically we now have 13.5 second block times.
Some people have 13.5 seconds and some people have 10.5.
Right, but okay, so, but yeah, there's now kind of like a band around like the block thing, where it's like the shortest is 8 and the largest 16, like you showed in your slide. But like we've like significantly deviated from the standard 12 second that it should be by the system's design.
And I think particularly if we look at just inside these extra slides, if we look at what blocks root is doing, they have their average at like 750 milliseconds, which is kind of funny in how it carries through into this profile. Because all of a sudden, if we drop the binning, we actually see these strong spikes at blocks root's times, where they have their hard cutoff.
I have a question that's not necessarily related to any particular slide, but I think more of like protocol design decision. And for proof of stake, it was designed with MEV not much in mind. I guess it wasn't, there was no enshrinement of anything like MEV boost, although it later became like very prominent in terms of percentage of rewards, much more so than timing games. And for a while, there was a discussion about maybe enshrining it and it seems to have dissolved off, or at least from maybe that's my Twitter timeline. But do you know what the state on this is? Is there any discussion of enshrining it into the protocol? Are there any pros, any cons? I think the discussion seems to have shifted to timing games being much more of an urgent matter. Yeah. What do you think on the topic?
Definitely still something that people are trying to do, right? So we call it enshrined proposer builder separation. And POTUS from Prism is kind of the person that's pushing it the most. The main difference that they're trying to do right now, I guess, or maybe not the main difference, but the big change is that they're considering moving to slot auctions instead of block auctions. So with the slot auction, instead of a proposer committing to a block or to a block hash, they commit to a builder's pub key. And with that, you just say like, okay, like Beaver build is going to build the block, and then Beaver build just like all of a sudden has complete control over it, and they can play their games however they want. But you sort of like, you shift away from proposer timing games to kind of builder timing games, which like the question is this better or is this worse? And it's probably a little bit better because Beaver is very well connected and sort of equalizes the playing field for proposers. But it's just another can of worms that we're opening.
Okay, and there's a more recent discussion around layer twos and how MEV plays a role. I think in their current states, most if not all layer twos have a centralized sequencer, and therefore the type of MEV is slightly different because you can have like back running, you can have single transaction like atomic arbitrage, you can have sextex arbs, but you can't really have front running or sandwich stacks. Have you looked into any layer 2 data? And do you have any thoughts on it? There's also, I'll first start with this.
I would say the state of art is still there's no like number that is in consensus as in like measuring L2 MEV. Like Dolby has this data set on Dune, and there were a few papers from academia side, but they are more like just a static capture and are fairly outdated, like which is our like 2 years ago kind of data. Besides that, we don't really know any other L2 data. So yeah, Dolby is the only one who actually curated a live capturing of MEV data, but we will have to see like what the searchers say, or like if something like libEVM kind of data to come up and like compare. Because like even the L1 MEV data is a mess today. Like we have EigenPhi, we have MEV-inspect, we have libMEV, but no one agrees with each other, including even the new one from Solar Labs. So and like everything seems to be based off like heuristics, and when the heuristics is slightly different, the numbers can look really different. So we'll see. I think it definitely requires a lot of like searching experience to make it really good. Like for example, people appraise libMEV data set seems to be the most accurate. They themselves was a searcher and they're also a builder these days. So I'm looking forward to that. Flashbots is trying to fund like L2 MEV projects. So yeah, also a call out to any person listening.
Okay, I still got work to do on my data sets, and maybe it can help a little bit. I think libMEV was praised by in an interview with how's he called from Subway? I forgot his name.
Jared from Subway.
Yeah, there was an interview with him where he was saying Liberty had the best data set, and I think that kind of boosted the confidence in the data set. But yeah, I agree. There's work to do. I think there's also the different types of MEV. Like sex dex arbitrage is like the hardest, I think, to really single out properly. And it's also the biggest in terms of MEV. So it's a big thing that we need to work on, I guess.
Yeah. And I feel like I wrote a L2MEV discussion post in Flashbots forum a while ago using Adobe's dataset. And I think like the dataset at least like penned a fairly fine benchmark, at least to start with, where I'm seeing a lot of like arbitrage or atomic MEV happening, and mostly arbitrage. But I don't see many sandwiching, which kind of makes sense with the state of L2 today because there's no mempool, it's single sequencer. There was sandwiching happening, I think, for a while for Optimism, which was in line with the info I have where like I think the mempool was leaked for a little bit of time. So that kind of makes sense. So yeah, that's I think where we're at today. And I guess like to expand on the topic here is I think there's no really like PBS research done for L2 because the whole setup is different today. Right now it's like single sequencer and there's no mempool really, and there's no like proposal builder separation. So yeah, I don't think there's timing game there neither to talk about.
Yeah, I have a slight follow-up question. I think there's discussion lately with Justin Drake and Dan from Blockworks and other people about mostly base and how a lot of its revenue comes from MEV. And some were saying that there was incentives to essentially not decentralize because they would actually lose out on MEV. Do you do you understand that argument? Can you explain it? Or because my understanding is that the Coinbase probably making it more heavy towards themselves rather than individuals by not decentralizing, whereas decentralizing would mean more people can participate and kind of take some of that MEV. But maybe I'm wrong here. Yeah.
Yeah. Also just to provide a little bit more context of what I saw on my timeline, and I also don't understand pretty much the discussion. I also like would look for anyone who understand here. My understanding is like first of all, like Max Resnick come out and says the current EF roadmap doesn't make sense because it's L2 centric, and L2 is like it's not really like how to say beneficial to like the ETH value capture neither, and L2 would want to make money. And then there is discussion with Justin Drake, and I think he quoted something wrong in the beginning. He was saying like most of the rewards or like basically fee for L2 comes from base fee, and that is trying to show that like most of the revenue for L2 validator comes from like block space demand or like basically congestion rather than I think MEV fee. But then somebody used a Michael chart saying, no, that's not true. Like 90% of the L2 fee comes from priority fee. So then at this point afterwards, I'm lost. And like, first of all, there's a bunch of assumptions. Like why? So there's the segmentation base fee and priority fee. Why like certain fee comes to base, certain fee comes to decentralized validator? Why cannot both of them come to decentralized validator? Is my question. And I don't know if anyone else here was following the whole debate or we're just confusing people here.
I think we're largely confusing people, but like maybe one like how like did somebody accuse Coinbase of actually ordering blocks within their sequence or like making like MEV profits from their own sequencing activities?
No, it's not. It's not like Base just is the example because it's like the biggest blockchain in terms of revenue. I think maybe Arbitrum is close by, but I'm not sure. I think Base is pretty high up, obviously, and therefore it comes up as an argument.
But
And it
there's no
also
math there's no math boost for Base. Like how would Coinbase be making like MEF profits?
So the way Base works, or I guess maybe most L2s, at least OP Stack, is that it's not really an EIP 1559 market, and there's kind of a first come first serve kind of style of things, and therefore they have more control
You're
over where the
sorry. You're talking about Arbitron or Base. I think Base is gas priority fee auction. Arbitron is first come first serve. To answer back, connecting to Boxer's question, there is MEV even without an MEV boost, where like now Base basically is the only proposer, or you can think it as like the only miner in the proof of work day, and they basically see all the transactions coming in, and they can just order it by their want, right? Like, and they can order by priority gas fee from high to low, but they can also try to like arrange them to have the maximal like value extracted or add anything. It's just like theoretically it's possible, but we're not saying like they're doing that. But I think the accusation of saying like most of value comes from MEV would be saying a lot of the gas fee paid out or like the builder tip. I mean, yeah, you're right. There's no MEV boost, so everything will be attached to priority fee. Are coming from MEV profits of the searcher.
So one of the interesting things that sort of comes up is that people sort of believed that Ethereum staking yields would be much higher, and particularly from priority fees. So if we look at sort of how these rewards evolve based off the number of validators, what we see is that when more validators enter into the system, the issuance of the network goes up. So you kind of get this like slower drop off, and basically the rate that issuance goes up is proportional to the square root of the number of validators. But then there's also that many more validators. So you end up with a profile that drops off at 1 over the square root of n. But the MEV rewards, they don't increase at all. So you're just distributing those over a larger validator set. So a lot of the predictions in the early days were made when there were only like 5% or 10% of validators participating. And basically what that means is that execution rewards were far more important at the time. But as we see now with something like 30% of the supply staked, instead of most of the rewards coming from execution rewards, all of a sudden we're back to consensus rewards being this more important part. And that's kind of why timing games and even block proposals in general just aren't quite as important anymore. Sort of what matters in terms of the long-term optimization is just having like consensus clients that work really well.
How is the like, I guess, total MEV revenue that searchers are making, or like that, like in general, like the MEF must decrease as like ETH L1 activity decreases, right? So like there must be a few like big paydays every couple of months when there's like a bunch of liquidations and stuff, but overall it seems like Ethereum L1 is no longer that important. And like all of the like games that Jared from Subway was playing with the meme coins and stuff, like they're very heavily dependent on there actually being like a lot of economic activity on ETH, right? And I honestly haven't looked at the DEX trades volume chart in quite a while, but like people are getting more sophisticated. There's more sophisticated tools. Like people are protecting their transactions. Like all of this stuff like doesn't like. Are you hearing from searchers who are just like, this is no longer worth it? Like, what's the overall situation with these kinds of things?
I think in general, like L1 MEV, so we still don't have L2 MEV number, but I think in general, L1 MEV is still probably larger than L2 MEV in general, just because one is the chain is more delayed because it's like 12 seconds. And so there is more likely a, price difference compared to centralized exchange. And so like SexDex transactions, I would assume is like more likely happening on L1 and slower blockchain. And second of all, is like there are still people like trading on Ethereum for meme coin for some reason. And I mean, today's gas fee is not that crazy, I guess. Like I feel like back in the 2020, 2021 time, a lot of time I spent $100 for a complicated trade. But these days I feel like it's mostly a few bucks. And so it seems like, there's still retail activity going on, and sure, a lot of meme coin thing going to Solana, but Telegram bots seems to be paying big bucks, meaning coming from the users for those. So there's also Atomic and MEV going on top of that. But yeah, I think it's still going. But again, like comparing with the consensus rewards, it's only around like 10 to 30%.
So the like basically searches are still fine. Like I'm just making this up in my head that economic activity on L1 is actually declining. Maybe it's just like moved outside of like a field that I understand, or it's like I don't know, like really long tail meme coin traders and stuff like that. So like maybe I just don't hear about it anymore, but it still keeps happening.
I think like one point is that like I think it's still happening, but it's possible as to your point is that they're making less money, like because more and more money needs to be paid out to a proposer. Is my assumption. Yeah.
It's very dependent also on like DEX volumes in general, I guess, where the more volume there is, the more there's to sandwich. Sex DEX ARBs is also dependent on pools having high liquidity and being heavily traded on, so that there's arbitrage options. And atomic arbitrage is all the same. You need discrepancy across pools, and on L2s, there's actually a few pools that are very high in terms of liquidity and trading that allow for atomic arbitrage to take place, whereas on L1 there's just a lot more things going on. But I guess as things move slowly, off of L1 and onto L2s, as the current roadmap kind of leads us, maybe that MEV moves off to being higher on L2s. I just don't think it's the case yet, and the data we have is, like we said, is always so far not super complete, especially since there's parts of MEVs that are just much harder to identify. But yeah, there's work to do there for all data people.
I see. Do you have another insight for us, DataAlways?
No, I mean, I think that you guys are kind of right. As gas fees drop, yes, it does mean that there's less activity, but the other thing it means is that searchers have to pay fewer fees, right? So, I mean, they're still going to be transacting and still making money. It's just a bit of a shift in where that comes from.
Right, the operational cost of the searches also really goes down, so they can take care of like much smaller, like whatever value they find. Oh, that's interesting. I didn't think about that initially. Yeah, well, like it's kind of interesting how the blob space has now freed up Ethereum L1 space again for like actually just doing DeFi or actually just doing meme coin trading. It's like, yeah, it's still like way more expensive than Solana or any of these other things. But as Danning mentioned like a minute ago, it's like, yeah, I was paying like $500 for transactions in the like height of DeFi summer. It's like now we're like, yeah, like you could actually like reasonably trade meme coins again, which is that's kind of interesting. But I guess like nobody has anyone seen like projects dedicatedly kind of launch on L1 nowadays. Like I only see stuff launching on Base or Zora or Blast or stuff like that. And it's like on L1, I mostly see like,
Restaking.
Okay. But they can't really. I mean, they could like do bridged ETH and then restake over somewhere else, which I think Mantle is kind of trying to do that. But yeah, okay, I see. Yeah, I guess this is actually kind of good for the restaking ecosystem. But yeah, at the same time, low fees are also bad for the restaking ecosystem. Like in general, like ETH not being utilized properly is not great. But okay, cool.
There's still quite a few launching on L1 because it has the most mindshare still over L2s, and there's also a tradition of like launching on the L1 and then maybe like wrapping on L2s or bridging onto L2s as an expansion of the protocol. I don't know. I don't have any specific example. That's not the point, but like that's the trend I've been seeing. But maybe that trend shifts over time, and we see more and more L2 native protocols.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying. I don't see anyone launching on L1 anymore. like every like new project, and like even like if I look at Dune internal data, it's like we get more contract submissions for L2 like stuff nowadays than we do for L1. And like of course there's like a sum of L2s that's much greater than like all like the L1s that we index. But I think in general it seems like it's very like it almost seems like the consensus of the industry now is to not launch on L1 anymore, because the congestion could always start again, like you don't, like if there's
Yeah.
a day without traffic in Jakarta, you're like you're not gonna be like, oh, let me build my house here, it's probably gonna be fine, and then like I don't know, like the next day you got traffic again or something like this. Yeah, I guess that must be the rationale. Like I don't know. That would be I should look into this, on like try to find out what are even people doing still on L1. I don't understand. Except if you're a whale. Then it's obviously like, okay, you don't care about the fees and like all of that stuff. But yeah, back to the script. Uh, yeah, do you want to continue your presentation, Data Always? Do you have another interesting insight for us?
So this is from Bitwise's last report, and it definitely seems to indicate that there's been some sort of deviation between the number of validators and the amount of ether staked. But the reality is that they're just equalizing the axis here. And because every validator has 32 ETH instead of 30 ETH, there hasn't actually been a divergence at all.
Yeah, that's weird. That's very weird.
That's a that's a
Wait, what?
horrible chart crime. This is hilarious.
Wait, so each validator has a 32 ETH, and they're just like shifting the axis to make it looks like
No,
diverging.
because they're plotting it on sort of both axes with like one line on one and another, and the like or the fill on the other side. But they're just trying to make the axes look nice by having like a 30 times multiplier on each side. But every validator is 32. You just see this growing divergence between the two.
Oh,
Yeah, they should have left out the lines on the like the I don't know, the guiding lines, and just had the like clean axis. This is horrible. Okay, interesting in how many ways you can fuck up data, because this genuinely looks like there's a higher growth in validators than there's amount ETH staked, which wouldn't make any sense. Interesting. That good find. All right. I think with that, we have the chart crime. I want to point out that in the paper of Data Always, or in the blog post that you released on playing latency games, or however, what's the real title? I kind of forgot. Right now.
Latency is money.
Yeah. In that blog post, there's beautiful GIFs in there. Some of which we were also able to see in this presentation. So maybe how do we actually make those? I'm genuinely curious how to produce charts.
Yes,
like
I
this.
mean, if you're working in like Python or Dune or something, all you have to do is capture sort of like snapshots at like different steps, right? So for those GIFs, right, the idea is just to shift the interval by a couple of days, and then if you want to make it look nicer, you can add some like transition effects or something, but just throw it into a GIF maker afterwards.
Yeah, but how do you actually make the GIFs? Like, it's easy. Like, I can conceptually kind of conceive of this, but then, like, do you? I don't know. Walk me through the process. Like, you have the raw data, and then is there like a Python package for this that just does this for you, or like
Yeah, I
how
have a
do you
Python
stitch
script
those
that does
together?
it, but you could just as well like use any online tool or something if you wanted to.
I gotta look into this. This would be a blog post I would read. Wink, wink. It's like, no, always a fan of chart art, and you definitely produce chart art. I think with that, Dobby, what do you know about latency games now?
Well, quite a bit more. I think I both know more and know there's a fuck ton more to research. So I think I don't know if we come out better or not, but we got work to do.
That's okay. I for one feel very illuminated, I guess is that word. I don't know. I learned a lot. I really like this. This presentation style is a bit weird for a podcast. We usually do more of a presentation. But you did a great job, DataAlways. Thank you so much for presenting this data to us. And it almost felt like I was in a lecture in university. It's like a very very good experience. Like some good memories from that. So thank you for providing this experience, and I certainly learned a lot. Yeah, kilns should stop their shit. Like, what are they doing? So, the next time you see a kiln guy, just tell them stop. And yeah, thank you so much for coming on. All right, with that, you have listened to the Index podcast. Thank you for listening. Share this with your friends. And yeah, we'll catch you all in 2 weeks. Bye bye.
Crypto day wasters, come join us for the parade.